Hi there, everyone. This is Sharon, the founder of Self Care for Black Men, and we are here for Voices for Black Men. And today we have a special guest, Gidai. You see that I pause. And again, it is me. And so today our topic is suicide in the Black community, and especially among Black men. And before we get started, what we're going to do is, as we usually do with Self Care for Black Men and Voices for Black Men, is we are going to, oh, let me see if that's on my end. Oh, give me a minute. Give me one moment. And so, all righty. Like I was hearing myself on my YouTube station. I was like, what was that? But anyway, before we get started, we're gonna pretty much just sit in silence. And so, and what I am going to do, what am I going to do? Give me one moment. All right, well, we're gonna go ahead and get started for a moment. That's not what I want to do. All right. And so thank you for your patience, everyone. And so again, wherever you are, if you're standing, that's okay. If you're standing, place your feet firmly on the ground. And if you're sitting, place your feet firmly on the ground. And you can lie down if you like. If you're driving, just listen, do not do anything. And so again, sit in a comfortable position or stand with your feet firmly on the ground. Align your back, relax your shoulders away from your ears, and have your eyes gaze towards the floor. And just have your hands comfortable on your lap, wherever it may be. And we just want to take a few deep breaths because a lot of times we go from one activity to another meeting without taking a breath. So let's just take a few breaths here. Just slowly inhale through your nose and exhale through your nose. The main thing is paying attention to your breath. And on each inhale, just pay attention. And each exhale, pay attention. And just continue to pay attention to your breath. Now bring your attention back to the surface. And this time we're going to take the deep inhale from your belly all the way up through your nose. And then exhale. And just inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. Exhale completely out. And now just gently open your eyes. And now we're here. And one of the reasons that we do this is because in our society keeps us in the fight, flight, freeze. And so it's really important to really just take the time to just breathe. And I know sometimes some people complain, it's like, oh, I can't do that because it's just so much. And it's the nervous system. And we'll be talking about that, in different episodes. And when I do my, the power of self-care. And this is why it's important so that we can be where we are. And so with our guests, Gidai, we're going to talk about suicide in the Black community, and especially how it impacts Black men. And so tell us a little bit about yourself first before we move on.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ms. Brown. And first and foremost, I appreciate the time, and I appreciate you just being intentional about my name. So my name is Gidai Maaza. I'm a LMFT. And for the folks that don't know what that means, it stands for it's a licensed marriage family therapist. I'm on the West Coast of the US, specifically California and the Central Valley. So Fresno is as close to the center of the state as it gets. So we like to, one of our claim to fame is that we are the center of the state. So a little bit about me.
Thank you for that. And so I wanted to bring this topic to the forefront. I know in general, like for anybody who follows self-care for Black men, we're always so positive and inspirational and just talking about different things. And the whole goal of self-care is to hopefully where someone will not experience that leads up to suicide. And so in saying that, part of it is we do need to have a conversation about it because there are lots of misconceptions and just lots of things people don't know. And one thing that I've learned on a personal basis and professionally is anything that we don't talk about doesn't get talked about. And so we really do need to talk about suicide. So in general, like if we just say the word suicide, what kind of comes to your mind when you just hear that? Just the word suicide.
Two things. Death, so physical, the literal physical form of death. And then I think the one that isn't oftentimes talked about in suicide, which is this emotional, social, like visual pain that we experience as Black men and boys that we house in our bodies. Mm-hmm. So death in those two forms, but also loneliness, also secrecy.
Mm.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big one, the secrecy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we can dive into it, Ms. Brown, and I'm co-signing this idea of what we don't allow space for, right, which is the idea behind secrecy, or room for. We can't begin, I think personally, to heal. Mm-hmm. Right. So I love this idea of conversation, and it's probably one that like for a lot of my men, and especially my young men, drives me crazy because they come to me seeking a solution, seeking an intervention. And you know, my style and my form tends to be, we're going to slow down first. We're going to understand your history, your story, what that means to you, for you. And then we get into this idea of depersonalizing the experience just enough to where we can see it outside our bodies and outside our minds. Mm-hmm. So conversation is key to this process. So I definitely appreciate just you being even able to articulate that for folks, that this idea is let's talk about it first. And I actually even challenge this idea of conversation with, let's talk about the secrets. Let's talk about the dark stuff, mm-hmm. right? Because oftentimes it's easy to feel good, and survival mode almost always tells us, in the back of our brain will almost always tells us to feel good first, mm-hmm. right? So a lot of my young men already are coming with this pain that they don't like to talk about, but I push them, you know, gently and nudge them gently into know, you know, your freedom is actually in the dark. Mm-hmm. Let's shed light to that first.
Yeah, most definitely. And when you had said this notion of feel good, it's like, I see that a lot. You know what I mean? It's one of those things. And one of the things that I tell people, and I've even learned this too, you know, on a personal or in a professional basis, especially when I'm helping people through things, is that I guess the best way that I can say it is, what I have learned about myself is that even though I've been in this field for a long time, but I myself really either don't know how to experience or never experience things that are uncomfortable. So you find a way to avoid it. So it's like, I never felt that. Oh, that's what that is. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, this is what our internal being does to protect us. Yeah. But at the same time, in the long run, it's not helpful, you know? And so, because you were talking, and that kind of goes into what you were talking about earlier, of how things live into the body. And so, meaning that we don't even know, because I'm into this body thing now, embodiment thing. So we don't even know. I kind of feel like this is what the thing that people deal with the most, is because of not knowing what to do with this thing that make us feel awful, you know, not to know what to do with it, because it physically hurts. Is, you know, it's not just an emotion, it physically hurts. And I kind of say, like, the nervous system just doesn't know what to do with it, you know, and learning what that is and what it looks like, and know that there's going to be a other side of it. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to kind of just point that out. You know, it's, you know, and even though we kind of tell people, yeah, embrace what you're feeling and things like that, but it's a lot if you never experience anything, because the nervous system is like, what is this? Oh no, let's get out of here. Let's hide and duck, you know, and whatever it may be. But yeah, I do think that in acknowledging and recognizing that, you know, and I kind of call happiness fluctuates, and we need to know that. Mm-hmm. You know,
and I would also say this. I mean, just suicide it's a complex issue. I mean, to think that we have folks who in our community who, right or wrong, if we're being honest about it, are in so much pain that the only option that they see out, right, And by the way, they're a small percentage of our Black community, but then even a smaller percentage of folks who complete suicide, because that's different of our culture, but that they're in so much pain that their exit is like it's that fatal, and that's how raw I get with my young Black men and boys very specifically, because this is literally life and death. Like, we have an environment that's killing us, and then we have an internal environment that is also killing us, and then reacting to the outside world. So I tell my guys, like, this is life and death. And this idea that Black men and boys don't commit suicide, right? Like, we don't do that. We're too far in love with life. Like, I remind my guys, be careful how much of a fantasy that we live in, because we got to remember we're human first, and then we're men, and then we're Black men, right? So this idea that we don't do this, again, the secret, we don't do this, we're too in love. There's truth to that, but be careful, because that becomes a fantasy, and that becomes a cover to, we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in adding to that, that is kind of like where people, if they're having those feelings, that is just so overwhelming for them, that makes them less likely to talk about it, to seek help and things like that. And then especially, I would say, depends on, like the type of personality a person has.
Absolutely.
Just meaning if you're a happy go jolly type of person, or someone has a particular stature in the community or in your school, or you're the captain of a football team. I'm just using as those are examples, just meaning if someone looks up to you, especially the strong friend, but not realizing what that person has to carry, and so, so there's a, oh man, I mean, it's almost like this topic, it doesn't get talked about enough. And even when you talk about it, there's just so many different angles that you can really explore, to be honest. But the main thing is that it does exist.
Yeah. It exists, and it's happening. Like, I keep it that present. It's happening. This isn't something historic, although like the historic part of it is very relevant to us. It's very present, and very specifically, and here's the thing, I'm careful with statistics, because I think the societal statistics, I'm big on language and the importance of language, of suicide for us as Black men, is very tricky because of the who, what, where, when, why, right? Again, we don't do these things. So oftentimes suicide is categorized as something else, right? There's a racial element to it. So I'm careful with statistics, because I think they're dismissive, and they don't tell the full picture of us as like Black men in general. Mm-hmm. However, we're talking about boys between 5 and 7 are committing suicide, right? And then we take that even further across the span of us as Black men, and it's a lifespan challenge. You know what I'm saying? Everything from 5-year-olds all the way to some of our men that are like in their 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. So this is happening, whether we feel a way about it or not. We have to be able to be raw about it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, one thing that I've seen in working in the field, in that, let's say someone does come forward whether it's a child or adolescent or an adult, I kind of call it, with the everyday living, sometimes what happens, what I've seen is that, and people don't mean any harm by it,
Mm,
but it's like they kind of going back to the happiness type of thing, you know? It's kind of like where everything is going to be okay. You have everything to live for. Why would you? You have everything going for you. Why would you do this to your family? But then, let's say, you know, um, back to the home life, the person
mm,
decides not to do it, but there's still dynamics, they are still there, but nothing has really changed,
right.
And so I'm not really making a question per se,
Mm,
but and I see it kind of for both sides too, meaning like for family and friends, it's a lot on them as well, to worry, to think. And, there's so many different scenarios out there. I don't even want to get into anything specific per se, but, and I guess I really just want to focus on the person who may be experiencing those thoughts. And for, someone who's watching and trying to figure out how it can help, it's kind of like, okay, well, you're telling someone that they have everything to live for, but nothing has changed on the external. So how can family and friends really help? You see what I'm saying?
That's
I
another
know,
complex one because
I know, I know.
for me, what it goes back to, Miss Brown, is number one, it's scary, right? To think that we take our lives. So part of the larger community language, it needs to be around what are our fears, right? As a community and as a family, when someone comes to us and says, I don't want to live,
Mhm.
right? There's prevention, intervention stuff, right? Crisis management, making sure that folks are, that we as men are taken care of where we need to be. But I think it's this larger, for me, psych ed of the community, right? So where am I coming from, for example, if my brother, and how much of my work have I done to really hear him? Because that's the other challenge I think for us as folks is, not only are we afraid because we don't know what to do, right? Let alone a therapist, if we're being real. A therapist, we don't honestly know what to do, and we're not necessarily trained to that depth, except to go back to let's make them feel good, right?
Mhm.
Rather than let me hear what you have to say and how can I like keep you safe,
Mhm.
But I know that because, I've been trained and all kinds of good stuff. So that's a tough question to answer. I hope what I put out there to the audience makes sense. A lot of this is conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and psych ed of the community, for example, a lot of my young men that I work with, we almost always are revisiting this idea of not only safety, but what safety and language means to us.
Yeah.
So my young dudes, all they've ever experienced, as extreme as this may sound, is to house our pain, right?
Mhm.
And what do? We let it live, it digests in our bodies, the nerves start acting up, and then eventually it comes out. So we talk about, the difference between letting these thoughts live in us that are very normal for everybody, if we're being honest, including myself, right? And how do we allow that stuff to leave us, you know, like the church may even say to let go of. But again, none of these things I think really just, they can't happen, and nor can we help our Black men and boys from a place of fear,
Mhm.
and unhealthy fear, right? That says, I'm gonna save you, and how dare you want to do this to friends, family, community. Um, it's tricky. It's tricky, but again, it goes back
Yeah.
to, you know, what I hear from my guys is Um, the only way I know how to articulate my pain and to get attention for my pain, for example, is to say I'm going to hurt myself, right? Versus somebody that will actually commit suicide. Again, for me, there's huge differences. I've only experienced, for example, one person in like my career who has committed suicide, and as raw as this may sound, there was nothing anybody could do. Multiple hospitalizations, family support, contracts that were drawn up, and that individual was that far inside. But the vast majority of my young Black men and boys, like once we start IDing these like scary thoughts, suicide, and we start differentiating the language, oftentimes what comes out is I'm hurt. And the only way I know how to say I'm hurt physically is through my hands and feet, right? Violence. And or I have to make my language big. I got to get big about it.
Yeah. And by you saying that, I think that's probably one of the main things that kind of comes out of what I just was asking. Part of it, I really just wanted to bring attention to it in one sense where people, if you have family members, there are things that you can do, but then at the same time, there's things that sometimes nothing that you can do, but to really listen to the pain.
Right.
And most of the time that's what people need, is for someone to listen to their pain, and hopefully through other things where when we kind of talked about earlier how that pain feels inside the body, what I tell people is that it would dissipate. It really does, if you can work through it. And that, kind of again, as a society as a whole, no one ever really talked to us about that. You know what I'm saying? It's like, what do you do when you're feeling pain? I say in general, men suffering in silence, women talk, but at the same time, sometimes we're not always talking about those deep feelings. But for both men and women, no one never really taught us how to deal with, the pain that comes through our body, and that's the thing we end up avoiding the most. And then, when it's too much for the nervous system, and then it's too much for the person, in which it is true.
Absolutely.
It's not about, I always try to say, it's not about being strong. It's not about that. It's just too much, and it's too much to process, Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, we can take this to depths, and one of the other things I think about, especially when it comes to our community, and this is a harsh reality, and I know that it kind of sits differently with folks, but our community did its best from the west coast of Africa into the States to survive.
Yeah.
Did the best that we could do.
Oh yeah.
And then that best turned into, right, like when we talk about a hostile war like zone in America for Black folks, and specifically Black men, that turned into our parents doing their best to protect us. And oftentimes them protecting us wasn't in the healthiest ways. It was the ways that they literally knew to do, because if you were strong, if you were tall, if you were fast, if you were articulate, those were all danger signs, right? You were going to be sold off and taken from your mother and your father. So our folks understood early on the best thing to do, right, as wild as it may sound, is to keep us close. There needs to be a level of harm. Now, was that conversation had? No. And rightfully so. Our folks didn't have time for that. And then that led on to this idea for me of secrets, right? More and more secrets to protect and survive. And now we're at a time where this like wound, you know what I'm saying? Like the soul wound that's super deep is wide open. And it has other folks perpetrating, you know, Black men and boys literally to the point of death. Which is why for me, like this idea of suicide is something that absolutely has to be talked about. It has to be in a very raw and real way, because if it isn't, it's this elephant in the room that we keep dancing around, right? And oh, well, so and so took their life. Oh my gosh. Rather than, yes, so and so took their lives. So what are we going to do about that? Words and creating space for words is it's a powerful piece.
Most definitely.
Speaking truth.
Yeah. And kind of piggybacking off of what you were saying about what we're going to do about it, you know, with my self-care brand between conscious sharing and self-care for Black men, is, you know, one of the things I talk about is, can we sit in the fire with someone? You know, because, you know, one of the reasons that we really need to do our own inner work, internal work, self-care, you know, self-care means different things for different people, but the main thing is freeing ourselves, and, you know, that having a self-reflection, introspection, and self-evaluation, and so that anything where we're stuck at, you know, it can be released. And a lot of times what end up happening is that someone can be reaching out for help, but then we don't have the capacity to sit with them. Because to be honest, it's a lot. You know what I'm saying? Because I've even realized how much I love what I do. I've been in vicarious trauma most of my career. You know what I'm saying? Because no one talks about it, even, you know, like for mental health practitioners, you know, mental health professionals is like what trauma does. You know, it's not even about thinking about it. It's just what trauma does to the body, you know, in and of itself. And we're, you know, hearing about different people's stories and experiencing with them as well. It's a lot, you know? And so, and just think about someone who's not, you know, in this field, what it does to their nervous system. And so sometimes I think people want to be there, but then don't know what to say. But I really have this, you know, my notion is that people kind of physically can't be there because it's too much for their own nervous system to even support someone, you know?
Absolutely. And, you know, again, a lot of layers there. This idea of community care, which is actually where we as Africans come from, outside of this Western world, you know, and part of that community care included individual care first. You know, this idea that if you even think you're going to be available to support somebody, you need to be available to yourself first, which is a very, very hard thing, because again, you know, the nerves and the heart and the brain want to jump to, oh my gosh, I need to take care of this person, which is not, you know, I'm not saying take care of that person. Absolutely take care of that person, but slow it down a bit, right? Recognize where you're at, and do your best to listen before you make that initial big crisis move, you know? And like you said, it's hard to sit in the fire. It's hard. That doesn't come as like second nature to folks, because sitting in the fire means death, you know, literal death. And then it also means death in the way of like, it's gonna hurt. It's gonna hurt. It might hurt a little, it might hurt a lot, but it's gonna hurt.
Yeah, most definitely. And one thing I want to, you know, let people know is that if, you know, them themselves or someone that they know are having any thoughts of not wanting to live, wanting to die, wanting to kill themselves, there is a lot of support out there. you know, and to definitely reach out and talk to someone. And one thing that I like about now compared to probably even 10 years ago, definitely 15 or more years ago, is that there's so many to choose from, you know. And generally, when it comes to the medical field, they're going to always tell people, you know, to go to see a therapist, you know, go to the hospital and things like that. And in which all of that is true too. But what I have found from a personal and professional basis, and what I've learned, especially in the past 5 years, is that there's so many different ways for you to get support, and that's therapeutic. And the mental health field and the medical field really need to embrace it even more, because I have to say this too, and I don't know if it's been your experience and observation, is that sometimes even the mental health field cannot always be so helpful. You know, some of it is a system itself, but to tell everybody to go to therapy, therapy isn't for everybody. And we just have to be real with that, you know, especially talk therapy. And that's why I'm like, you know, the embodiment and recognizing the nervous system is really important. And I say that because just because someone may not talk about it, because it's too much, and they may not need to talk. They may need to be able to release all of that stuff that's in there, that fear. And there's some things that words just really cannot always do. But you know, like for self-care for Black men, and there's Black Men Heal, there's Oasis that can connect you with mental health services. And then there is Black Boys they do meditation and yoga. And there's so many other things out there. Listening to podcasts, you know, and I'm coming across even more podcasts, and it's just different ways of how you can learn about yourself, and then learn different ways of how you can cope about things that you may not even realize that's there, but there's lots of support, you know. And I just want people to know that it may not look like the way that you think it would be, but you may just be pleasantly surprised, you know. You know, but definitely, you know, also saying too, if someone's actually, you know, having any attention or plan, yeah, definitely that's when you go to, you know, I kind of call it, you know, the medical place, the mental health at that particular point. But if it's before that point, all the other things that I just said, yeah.
I like this idea of that therapy takes many forms. I don't personally use the word therapeutic. I come from a world of understanding where everything is a form of therapy.
Yeah.
So the barbershop.
I like that, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. No, I was going to say, I like that better, to be honest. And really, the medical field and the mental health field has really said, you know, these other things are therapeutic. But I agree with you, to be honest. Yeah, I'm right there with you.
I just sit and live with, you know, that we come from a different, very ancient understanding of self-care, self-harm reduction, that is directly connected to Africa, right? Cooking, you name it. I mean, haircuts, church, family meetings, large community gatherings, right? The parties, living in one household with multiple generations. You know, we've done these things before that were therapy based. Many are reasons they've been lost. But what excites me about this generation specifically, and probably even in the last like 5 years, is that these young folks, and specifically young Black men, have really, really opened like the wound, that deep soul wound. And some of it very visceral, you know what I'm saying, where we can see us being killed on TV, but we've reversed that and said, like, enough of that is enough. We're going to use what we have access to really, shed light like on what's going on. But I mean, for me, the barbershop is where it's at, and I'm a therapist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My wife will tell you this, like, easily about an hour, but an hour will turn into almost 2 hours because we're just sitting there chopping it up with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be everything from a haircut to what's going on in our homes or in our internal lives, So again, therapy takes many forms. I think that we can't forget that we have access to those forms as people. Like the old folks say, that there's nothing new under the sun. I think that's the same. We don't have to change this thing to heal. We can go back and reach for the old school stuff, and then add a little bit of flavor to it as well, like with this generation. But you're absolutely right. And then on the flip side of that, yeah, like if somebody is actively in crisis, thoughts, actions, specifically a plan is in place. As hard as it may be, we have systems that we can reach out to. And again, as hard as it might be to reach out to the system that historically doesn't necessarily benefit us, right? It's another fear thing that lives and is very real that may not benefit us. However, those hotlines, right? Those suicide hotlines, those 24-hour hotlines that you can catch on Google that are across the nation. I love the fact that our therapy world is really, really stepping up, especially in the pandemic, where we and insurance companies are stepping up and saying folks need mental wellness. So you can access that, from California to the Carolinas fairly easily and almost, well, not almost, in a very legal way. I see folks in Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, and California. I've never had access like that because of the legal loopholes that we as therapists have to abide by. But now we have this greater community access to us. Yep.
Oh yeah, most definitely. That's definitely very helpful when it comes to that, because a lot of times for some people just may not have that access, without that. And like I said, it's just so many different ways. And again, this is kind of like the whole purpose of self-care for Black men, is to really just let Black men know in like different places you can go, different conversations, and to really work on, the internal part, the self-talk, the conversations that you have with yourself, and know that I've been listening to Dr. Miles Monroe lately, and of course he's just a powerful person, teacher, minister. And and one thing he talked about, he said, I'm trying to remember the exact wording, but it was kind of like, he's had several sermons or teachings regarding this, but he was like, everyone is born with a gift. That seed in you is a gift. And if you don't know what your gift is, you got to go look for it. Someone has something that you need, that they need. You have something that someone needs, but you may not know it yet, and they may not know it yet,
Mhm.
And one thing I can say too, I can say that for myself, not that I never felt that I wasn't needed, but I felt I didn't know. I was doing a live on my other platform, and I just have a certain way about me. And then in the live, I think at the time that I was talking, I was like, oh my, I got a story now. Because, for me, for the most part, I am like a happy-go-lucky person. I've had, dark moments in my life. There was one time I would say when I was in a really dark moment, and I would say I felt like it wouldn't matter if I lived or not. I didn't have suicidal thoughts per se, but it just didn't matter. And that happened just for a short moment, then, I'm like, let me get back. But because of the experience that I was having and where I am now, I'm like, oh my, that's my story. Because I've always been, kind of the person that I am, up until those little dark moments. But before I didn't have a story, to say, oh, we're do this, do that, da 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 da. But now I have a story. And so, not to say that everybody needs to have a story. However, most of us probably do in some form or fashion, because, like other than, living in a single parent household, coming to low income family, I had that story, but now I have something else on what I've gone through and where I can show people it's like, hey, I've been through this. And even though you may be there, but there is a other side for it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so when you do it, even if you're currently living in a story, or as Miles Monroe say, seasons don't last,
Mhm.
and what he says, God put you through those things so that, you're going to come out of it and you can help someone else. It's kind of like that's your gift, because it brings out, he said, those things, crisis bring out those things in you to help you get on the other side that you may have never thought about before, so
The
yeah.
idea that a crises have opportunities in them, I think is, I mean, it's critical, it's crucial. And I also think it's one of those solution intervention based sort of ideas for me. And for me, it just goes back to us being okay telling our story,
Mm-hmm.
because nothing happens or has happened in our lives just out of nowhere. There
Mm-hmm.
was an experience that caused a brain chemical reaction, that caused a body reaction, that caused a heart action, and then an outcome. Um, so everyone has a story,
Mm-hmm.
everyone does for how they think, do, and act. Um, I just come, I get very careful about solutions and interventions, because I do my best personally to center folks' stories and identities, from a place of let me understand. Let me understand your loneliness. Let me understand that really dark part of you that feels and thinks he doesn't want to be here. Let me understand him.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I
Yeah.
don't want to assume, because assumptions are 50-50 shots. And, as much of a therapist as I may be, I probably fail 99% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea for me, I'm big on just conversation and conversation for understanding. The statistics are out there. They do mean something, but they don't tell the full story, nor does research. Research doesn't tell the full human story. Um, and the flip side of that is I've personally seen folks that I've seen, and even family members come back out of suicide almost completing suicide, or even, the idea of thinking about it, and what they've come back, and I think this is the large majority of folks that I've experienced, they come back and tell me, man, if I had known that not only did this thing exist with me, but quite a few other folks, because I had to go to a hospital to see that connection. But if I had known that there was words that I could put to it, instead of acting it out, instead of storing it in my body, it becomes a different thing for me, you know? Again, the statistics are very real for completion. So, but the vast majority of us literally sit in this confused state of what it means, and what suicide is versus what it actually is. So the other part of conversation that I'm big on is putting words to our experiences, but then also providing like a framework and like a psych ed, the educational piece for our folks, especially my little dudes, because they tend to act out the most because their language is just developing. You know what I mean? So
yeah, most definitely. Yeah. And that pretty much also kind of coincides with, the pillars of self-care for Black men, is that, the first one is self-awareness. And then self-awareness is that introspection, self-evaluation, self-reflection. And then the second one is pretty much sitting in silence, because it's that piece where you may not be able to have the words, and then you may be able to feel it. And then deep rest. And that's kind of like, I guess you say, regulating the nervous system, generating it. Like I practice and teach restorative yoga. So that's one way of getting, because it's different from sleep, because it's to pretty much turn off that fight, flight, freeze, and to get into that, deep rest and that parasympathetic nervous system. And then the last one is movement or take action, and I always tell people, you really need all three of those things for the first one, for that self-awareness. And when you were talking about, having the words, but it's kind of like, in order to get the words, sometimes there's other things that may have to be done. And then like for people who are listening, I guess you could say one way of supporting, in which we've kind of already touched bases on it, is that, again, people really just need to be heard, and so the more we do our own self-work, then we can just hold someone's hand in the fire, so they can come up with the words. And I tell people this, a lot too, is that, not just children, even adults don't have the words when they're experiencing something. You just feel it, you just feel horrible or wherever it may be. And so just to be able to try and get to the core of what's going on with them, and just know that, hey, let me listen to this person. And then from there, then you may need to go and talk to somebody to kind of let go of all that energy that has come up, because it's not, we have to be real, when we're supporting someone, professional or not, it's not always the easiest thing, either.
Absolutely. I think the work is on the individual, but then it's also on the community, and then the folks within the community to put in the work to be well, even in the midst of crisis, like the crisis of, we're running out of time. We don't have time for this. A lot, even checking my words, it's a matter of life and death, like these extreme ideas, we can slow those down,
Yeah.
And here's another thing that I think is, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think you brought up something about movement, and I think movement, especially for us as Black men, is important to releasing, even before we put words to what's going on. It's important, and I think we can't forget that we come from a culture and a continent where movement was huge, right? Whether we were hunting or we were dancing movement was key to our wellness. You know what I'm saying? So I appreciate that that word and just that acknowledgement around movement. It's important.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so what are some last things or thoughts that you want to say regarding, suicide in the Black community and especially among Black men?
That's a loaded question, but to sum it up, doing something, it is important. It is, and I don't want to dismiss that idea, especially around thoughts of suicide. However, I just come from a space of like we can't heal what we aren't willing to speak, and viscerally, raw point out. Like I can be honest and say that I think there's a lack of compassion and care for young Black men and boys. That's just a fact. We see it across the board, in and outside the community. And that goes socially, that goes economically, it goes physically, those Maslow needs, those are facts. However, though, like the other piece of it for me that's important, I want like Black men and boys to hear this too, is the message being communicated through social media, maybe at the house, maybe within the community setting, has an element of like a lie to it, right? Don't believe it. It is okay to say something. It is okay to reach out to, whether it's your barber or your pastor or, your homeboy who has a solid head on him. I think that's important. It's okay to reach out. And it's okay to reach out and say, I don't know. Because I think that's another lie that we're fed, is we're not allowed to say, I don't know. And I'm letting y'all know now that that's a lie. It's okay to not know. It's okay to not know how you feel or what's going on with you. And it's okay to say that very clearly and specifically. And then, for like the global, and I think the country, y'all gotta be held accountable to this idea that like Black men and boys, whether it's through media or at school or in the workplace, like we need to change the message of you're not valued to, you are valued, you are a member of this society. You know what I mean? That's the greater system's responsibility, because everything, feeds off of that. And the other part of that message for the country, I think for me, is the message also needs to include that we have like meaning and purpose. You know what I mean? So that's what I would put out there. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And that's we definitely need that. And I would just add on to that is, I'm a big advocate of self-care. And so that goes into the personal relationships and even professional relationships, that we have, with each other, and, we can be thinking that someone reacts in a certain way, but did we ask, it's almost like where's your head at? What's going on? Because we just really never know. Regardless of how someone, even though somebody can say that they're okay, I'm like, if your senses just tell you something else, just ask again. And sometimes we're so busy, and this is why we need to slow ourselves down. Like in the beginning, we did, the pause for breathing. It's so important to incorporate that, because it allows us to get in touch with ourselves and allows us to listen. Yeah. Well, I do appreciate you coming on to Voices for Black Men. And this is a conversation, that needed to be had. Like I said, there's so many different ways, I guess you could say we can talk about it, but I just think it needs to be talked about.
Yep. No, thank you for having me. If I may, folks can follow me on Instagram at G Maaza LMFT. So feel free. I throw some 101s in there and try to open up dialogue and conversation with folks on there as well. It's the same thing for Facebook. Same handle. So please, yeah.
Well, again,